Thanks, Concorla. I have to say there is a huge element of a twilight zone, in my opinion, around this discussion, because the reality is of all of the issues in an era when we've been through enormous problems inside An Garda Síochána, this issue was in many ways the most serious. The idea that the Garda oversight body was the subject of surveillance by that organisation that it was supposed to be overseeing itself is, if you like, an appalling vista for the state to have to consider. And the issue really is have we dismissed the fact that that may not have happened? And I don't think that we have. And the way this report has been handled since it's been published has been, to my mind, bizarre. I mean, if you compare it to the Gearan report, where we had a 336-page comprehensive analysis conducted, massive media interest, huge analysis of it. Here we have a 65-page report thrown out with very defined viewpoints taken on it straight away to say what was in it, if you like, peddling a myth, and then nothing. No media interest, no nothing, and here we are on a Thursday afternoon with a handful of us here. And the problem is that the reality doesn't reflect what was in the report, because the new acting Garda Commissioner, as soon as the report was published, told us that it exonerated the Gardaí from any wrongdoing. Minister Shatter told us that it was proof positive that he had done a brilliant job, and I think, Minister, you kind of echoed some of those sentiments there earlier. Commissioner Callanan had previously said that there was no question of a single Garda ever being involved, and GSOC said, well, they were all right as well, because he kind of said that they had acted in good faith. But you see, the problem is that everybody can say that. You can say black and look at a white page, but you know, it still doesn't make the page black, and that really is the problem that we have here, because the roots of that is the way in which the report was constructed and the terms of reference it had. Because the reality is that there are many issues which were unexplained, and they remain unexplained today. Now, as I say, I think the root of that is the terms of reference of the report itself. And the government set an incredibly narrow focus for this investigation. In fact, the focus was whether GSOC had acted proportionately and reasonably in initiating a Section 102 investigation into Garda misconduct in the public interest. Now, GSOC are only ever lawfully able to investigate wrongdoing by Gardaí. Lawful behaviour by Gardaí would not be the subject of a public interest inquiry. And the focus of the report on that way, rather than saying, were there attempts being made to bug GSOC, and if so, by who? That really is what the report should have been about. But to my mind, it was set up in a way to precisely prevent that from happening. And actually, the limited terms of reference that were there were reinterpreted even more narrowly by former Justice Cooke, by him looking at the allegations in the Sunday Times article as his yardstick, rather than the Section 102 investigation. And I think that is something that your office and the press office took up as well, and the media subsequently ran with, if you like, because one of the first quotes from the Department of Justice was that the report concluded that the evidence does not support the proposition that actual surveillance ... took place, and much less that it was carried out by members of An Garda Síochána. But of course your phrase omitted the important qualifying words which were there in the middle, which was that actual surveillance of the kind asserted in the Sunday Times article took place. But it also ignored the fact that Cooke referred to the Sunday Times article as claiming to deal with government-owned technology, when in actual fact the Sunday Times article talked about government-level technology, which is an entirely different matter. So if you like, he was making a statement based on a false conclusion. And that was actually taken up by the rest of the media ad nauseum. I mean, we had huge examples of, you know, even the Irish Times, the so-called paper of repute, leading with headlines of no evidence of GSOC bugging, Cooke report finds. In fact, the report said that they could not exclude the possibility of some form of illicit eavesdropping may have taken place, which obviously is a very different headline. And I have to say the spin around this is quite incredible and in some ways borderline sinister, to be honest, because what's in the report doesn't reflect what people are saying about it, and I think that point absolutely has to be made, and it means that we have a problem now and we need to see what the government is going to do, because there are a lot of questions unanswered. I would like to put on the record that, in fairness to Mr. Cooke himself, and he is a mister, let's be clear about it, and that's not being derogatory, he is a former judge, but he himself actually goes to some lengths in his introduction to emphasise the limitations in the report. I would put it that he's been much more honest than the government has been on that, because he makes it very clear. He says that he has no authority to make binding findings of fact, much less definitive ones. He says his report doesn't have the authority to adjudicate on disputes of fact. He said he was reliant on voluntary cooperation of the parties concerned, and he's at pains to point out that this is just his personal evaluation and opinion. In other words, the conclusions of this report are not as comprehensive and as rigorous as the Minister has tried to point out, and indeed the Taoiseach and Taoiseach, because the conclusions are not judicial. They weren't reached by way of an independent and statutory inquiry conducted by a sitting judge with powers of compellability. And in fairness, he has been quite clear on this. It is a non-statutory paper review, and really by exaggerating Mr. Cooke's past employment of being a judge, it's trying to give a veneer of judicial backing when in actual fact it isn't. This is a paper review of secondary evidence rather than an investigation based on first principles. So we are exactly where we were before this report was published, and this matter isn't over. Because Deputy McLaughlin is quite correct. We have to look at this issue in the context of the background of what was going on at the time. And I won't repeat the points, but the background at the time were the Kieran Boylan affair, the inordinate delays which GSOC went to the lengths of holding a public press conference to show the massive level of uncooperation that they were getting from An Garda Síochána in terms of attempting to call them to account. Hundreds of cases outstanding on relatively minor matters where Gardaí were supposed to be disciplined, nothing taking place. And of course we know subsequently that former Commissioner Callanan around this time contacted the 4 Garda representative organisations and asked them to issue a public statement saying that they had no faith and no confidence in GSOC, which is quite incredible. And in actual fact, 2 of them did do that, the AGSI and the GRA. So what we have is the body charged with oversight of the Gardaí experiencing very sinister things happening, that's not disputed, at a time when this was going on in the background. And I would think they had a serious responsibility to deal with that, because there are huge implications from that situation. But I'd have to be honest and say that we are still none the wiser in that regard, because Mr. Cooke has no technical expertise himself. The world of surveillance is incredibly high-tech, and really what he's done, as indeed Minister Shatter, former Minister Shatter did before him, is favour one so-called expert report over another without really any further serious analysis. And I don't think it's surprising in that context that he reached the same conclusions as more or less as GSOC did, that there was no definitive evidence of unauthorised covert surveillance. But there's still no definitive evidence that there wasn't. And there's particularly no definitive evidence that it wasn't attempted, an aspect of the report in the terms of reference which was allowed for, but which Mr Cooke didn't seem to take any account of at all. And I'll deal with those points in a minute, but I first want to say that the biggest weakness of this report is that there was no examination of lawful surveillance. This was never investigated. It's an issue that I know Deputy Wallace put to former Minister Shatter on a whole number of occasions. I put it to him myself and he never answered it. Why was that point not answered? Did he not ask? Did the Garda Commissioner not ask? So how do we know if you don't ask the question? Now, the Minister is correct in saying that the report concludes there was no evidence of Garda involvement. But we have to say, how much emphasis can we place on that statement when it's made on the backdrop of not investigating or interviewing a single Gardaí, no attempts to seek the information, no request, for example, for a report from the Garda Commissioner to detail, for example, the access, storage, the logbooks of IMSI catchers, no analysing of the possibility of rogue Gardaí being involved in this. And let's remember that senior Gardaí were at the heart of the Kieran Boylan highly sensitive GSOC investigations. Is it beyond the realms of possibility that some of these people might have had a vested interest in surveillance on GSOC? Now, the fact that these questions weren't asked in some ways isn't really the fault of Mr Cooke, but it does come back to the limited terms of reference that were in place, and I think that severely weakens this report in its entirety. Lawful surveillance was never investigated. Let's be clear here. And if you were starting off, surely that would be the first thing you'd rule out, because if there was lawful surveillance, then he didn't have to go any further. We know that lawful surveillance is permitted by the Revenue, by the Defence Forces, and by the Gardaí. Now, there are, in most cases, that has to be the subject of a judicial order, but not all. And our law allows a situation under Section 7 of the Criminal Justice Surveillance Act 2009 for senior Gardaí to authorise other senior Gardaí to conduct surveillance. That is perfectly lawful, could have happened here, and would have been outside the remit then of the Cooke inquiry. We still don't have answers with regard to that situation, and there are a huge number of other practical issues which have not been answered by Mr Cooke. The issue, the most significant one, is the issue of the most significant anomaly identified by Verimus, that of the ringback. What Mr Cooke offers for that is he's no explanation. He doesn't even attempt to put one together. He said that that is unexplained. So the most significant breach of that is still unexplained. That in and of itself is, if you like, bad enough. But I have to say there are still a whole number of other questions that are unanswered as well. Issues such as the other deputies have referred to, the photographers at the airport. Who were they? Mr Cooke says they were likely to be members of the Garda Security Branch. That's who he thinks they were. Now, is it appropriate that the Garda Security Branch will be out in the airport taking pictures of an organisation that they knew were there to do work on behalf of GSOC? Does that not need further questions? I think it does. He says that the device in the media room, his take on the device on the media room, because he doesn't really know when he's posing questions, is that it could have been the person inside GSOC who leaked the issue to the Sunday Times, could have been the person who tampered with that device. That's what he says in the report. Does the Minister accept that? That she thinks that the GSOC themselves could have done one of the anomalies, because that's what Mr Cooke says. He's raising it out as a possibility. I think we have the issue of the identified person who tried to tamper with Verimus's evidence to the Cooke inquiry. Who is this person? Why they claim to be acting on behalf of An Garda Síochána? Who are they? I'd like more information on that, because all of these instances exist and they all remain unexplained. Mr Cooke accepts the information given by the GSOC commissioners that their phones were subject to ambient listening, by the fact that their batteries were dying in their phones within a 2-hour period. Now, those phones, the batteries don't die anymore. It stopped. Since this issue came into the public domain, the GSOC commissioners' phone batteries don't run down. which is pretty strong proof of an element of surveillance or ambient listening being in place. Mr. Cooke doesn't seem particularly interested in this or doesn't give it any attention at all. And I think that is a huge weakness in this, because he seems to suggest that it was Verimus themselves who were under surveillance. He doesn't seem to be, now maybe because surveillance is unregulated in Ireland, and in that sense probably lawful, that it was outside the remit of his report. I'm not sure, but I find it striking that he doesn't seem to appear in any way concerned that Verimus might be the subject of ordinary surveillance while conducting work for GSOC, or even curious as to identifying those who might have been responsible. And to me, that's pretty serious deficit. And in fairness to Mr. Cooke, he does state that this kind of evidence, this kind of examination could only be done by the subject of a statutory investigation. And here we are, back where we started, the need to conduct a proper statutory investigation so that we really get to the truth and get to the bottom of all of these issues. Now, he does deal with the GSOC question. He says they acted in good faith, although there's a bit of a slap for them. He says that Section 102 was premature. He absolutely ignores the fact that under Section 103, if in the public interest they felt that they didn't have to disclose a 102 investigation, they were lawfully entitled to do so. He doesn't in any serious way address that point. He also seems to place evidence on the fact, nearly suggesting that in order to be allowed to conduct a 102 investigation, that GSOC had to have the evidence, when of course the whole purpose of them investigating was to get the evidence to see whether their suspicion of surveillance was being backed up. I actually think that he's just done enough in this to allow GSOC say there was something in it for them, but to prevent the option of them having to take a judicial review. Because the only way of overcoming this report is by taking a judicial review, and the only people who would have a sufficiently strong legal interest in that would be GSOC. I think there has been an effort in the report to make Verimus and the Sunday Times out to be the demons, but I'm not sure that legally they'd have enough of an influence or an interest in taking a judicial review. So unless the government decides to look at this in a different forum, all of the questions which I've thrown out there remain unanswered, and they have to be seen in the context of the bigger picture, where there's been a huge amount of recognition of the need to move forward on issues of Garda accountability. Everybody now accepts that. We're going to have an independent police authority. We're going to have a beefed up GSOC. But we can't move on in the future unless we know the truth about the past. How could GSOC work with An Garda Síochána and have these issues unanswered? It's not fair to either party that that situation would pertain. So in justice to all concerned, I think we need to go back to the drawing board on this. And the only way to find out what really happened is to have a properly constituted commission of inquiry into this regard. I think it's also very, very necessary, given the level of the breakdown in trust and the breakdown in procedures that existed. Clearly, it was no secret that that was the case with former Commissioner Callanan and GSOC, but it's also the case with many of the higher ranks inside the Gardaí there. As you know, late as a couple of weeks ago, you had representatives of Garda organisations going public and saying that GSOC wasn't a fit body for their members to go to. So we have a huge problem here, and I don't think we can move forward in the manner in which the Minister has indicated that she would like to do so, without addressing the issues of the past, and this is the living past. And I think we should remind ourselves, I mean, you're not dealing with some, you know, Mickey Mouse outfit here. Verimus are a company of serious repute with high credentials here, and they have stood over their findings and the manner in which they have conducted themselves in this situation. And in fairness, there's nothing in this that contradicts that position on their part. So I really would, when the Minister is coming back in on this discussion, could she please deal with the issue of lawful surveillance, because there are a whole number of areas where lawful surveillance could have taken place and we are none the wiser. But what we do know with absolute certainty is that unusual events were happening, attempts to breach surveillance, unusual physical sightings of people who were unexplained, photographers and the like. We still don't have any answers, and I really think, Minister, your new reign, as it were, will be judged on whether you are prepared to rock the boat. I mean, my own feeling is that the idea that the possibility of the Gardaí bugging GSOC being vindicated would be enough to bring down the government. So therefore, I'm not surprised that the report didn't find that, but the question still remains.